very powerful work that both our speakers after the tea break have been involved in. So I won't detain you there, but I'll mention here that we're going to have a look with Professor Dr. Frédéric Rousseau from the University of Montpellier at the presence of colonial troops in French war museums. Just mentioning earlier in my introduction at the start of today the importance for us all, I think, to think about the way the war is rendered in public memory. And I think that is very much what Frédéric is going to talk about, with a special relationship to the colonial experience and its representation. So, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. We start? Yeah. In this paper, I would like to explore and comment on the way in which the so-called wartime effort of the colonies and the colonized is presented, exhibited, and staged in the two major French museums devoted to the history of the Great War. Both museums are located on former First World War battlefields. The first one, the historical, is in Péronne, Somme, at the heart of a territory long occupied by the Germans, but which was also the siege of the notorious and disastrous Battle of the Somme in July 1916, when many lost their lives, especially British troops and Germans. The second museum is located near Paris, in Meaux, in a region that suffered the particularly harsh times of the First Battle of the Marne in September 1914. I would add that at that time, the victorious advance of the German army was only just intercepted. In order to apprehend these two museums, I am going to use what we suggest calling museohistory. This is a new discipline defined at Montpellier University in the course of an international interdisciplinary research program underway since 2009. The program is entitled The Presence of the Past. It's dedicated to the study of the presence of painful pasts in 20th century war history museums. From a museohistory stance, both museums examined here are of interest on more than one count with regard to the subject of the colonies and empires of the Great War. First of all, it's worth nothing that they were open. It's worth noting, that they were open 2 decades apart. Péronne opened in 1992. Slide 1, okay, and slide 2. It should also be mentioned that Péronne was, and still is, a reference in the French and international museographic landscape in the same way as Caen for the Second World War. In addition, Péronne is linked to an international research center specialized in the history of the Great War. The center's researchers practice a cultural history of the war, mainly focused on the representations of war in societies at war. This group of researchers exercise a strong influence over the museum's narratives and beyond, with scholars, the media, and the general public. Other highly controversial, it's their interpretation of the history of the war, which has been very much predominant over the last 20 years. As far as Meaux is concerned, you can see Meaux, the museum was inaugurated on 11th November 2011 by the President of the Republic, Nicolas Sarkozy, himself, and the MP and Mayor of Meaux, Jean-François Copé, a former minister under Sarkozy, before becoming majority leader at the National Assembly. He is currently head of the main opposition party to President Hollande today. More museums came into being as a result of Mr. Copé's determination. While Peron is a historian's museum, more museums' narratives build on the collection acquired from a major collector, Jean-Pierre Vernet, who had assembled over a period of 40 years almost 50,000 objects from this period. We can say next, okay, so on. Comparing the two museums is therefore an opportunity to measure the possible evolution of French museographic, historical, and memorial discourse. 20 years apart, what importance is given to colonials and colonial troops in each of these accounts? From the outset, the fact that colonial references are relatively rare strikes the visitor. In both museums, while such evocation is not exactly absent, we can, however, refer to it in terms such as minimum service or politically correct. This gives rise to the question, why do the two most important Great War museums of France grant such a tiny place to the contribution of the colonies? Does this indicate a lack of historical awareness 100 years on? The categorical reply is no. The museums are not prevented from exhibiting the wartime effort of the colonies through a lack of knowledge. A number of historians have worked on the wartime effort demanded of the colonies and colonial population. Apart from Gilbert Meunier, here today, we can mention some other French historians such as Marc Michel, specialist of sub-Saharan West Africa, and Jacques Frémaux, amongst others. In other words, even if research is still lacking on a number of points, the people preparing the narratives for museum exhibitions are not exactly at loss. Thus, an explanation must be sought in the very conception and the ideological bias of museum discourse. Another remark. In both museums, the narrative centers very much around the Western world. The war in the museum in Peron belongs to the Germans, the French, and the British. In this respect, it must be remembered that this museum was thought out and built in a European perspective, that of the European Economic Community. And moreover, it was built partly with European funds before the fall of the Berlin Wall during the Cold War, when Europe was considered as Atlantic and Western. The geopolitical context, along with financing its use, explains the more than limited place given to other European actors. As already mentioned, the discourse in Meaux is built around objects and, above all, centered on France, even though Germany, as the principal enemy of the French, is also very much present. You can see we are entering the gallery entitled The Eve of War in Peron. We can see large anonymous portraits of civilians. In passing, it's surprising to see a number of non-European faces indicating subliminally that the population of the empires were also concerned by the war. A number of clues, generally in the form of fine objects, are distributed in the next gallery concerning the different colonial empires. The race for colonies is also illustrated. Madagascar and Morocco are two examples. Here is a diorama evoking the conquest of Madagascar and the imposition of the protectorate in 1895. Next. Here, it's plate. We can read, "Just a minute, my prince. The Algeciras Treaty prescribes peaceful penetration, so I am respecting the program." I don't comment. France obtained the protectorate of Morocco in March 1912. Nothing is said about what French protection represented for Madagascar and Morocco. A screen shows pictures of the Exposition Universelle in Paris in 1900. An exaltation of the French colonial empire and a confrontation of prestige between major powers, we can read. Then we have a panel entitled "Europe Dominates the World." This is the text. In 1914, European imperialist power was demonstrated through a complex set of relationships of influence. Some of these were strong, others purely symbolic. Great Britain exercised its control over imperial possessions, such as India. It dominated protectorates like Egypt and Sudan. It maintained a link as a mere formality through the monarchy with self-governing dominions such as Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Canada. Algeria was an integral part of France. Morocco was run by a French resident general. The rest of Africa was divided up, exploited, and pillaged. It's the end of the citation. It's no doubt difficult to find the proper tone and degree of nuance. The writer of the exhibition has a delicate role, that's sure. Even so, should we conclude that India, Egypt, Sudan, Algeria, and Morocco were not exploited and pillaged? It's a little strange. Still, in Peron, French, British, and German fighters are conjured up by means of shallow pits dug out in the floor. This relates, of course, to the death of the soldier on the battlefield. You can see the pits. Here, no upright dummy, but uniforms, military gear, and the arms of each national army, or what we also call panoplies. All the same, it should be noted that colonial soldiers have not been forgotten here. They even have their own pit qualified as "call to the empires." Curiously enough, this includes the uniform of a Senegalese infantryman, one of an Algerian infantryman, and another of an Australian. What a surprising amalgam. Nothing indicates the brotherhood of arms that may have developed between imperial and metropolitan French troops. The device puts the Africans who were forced to participate to the European butchery on the same footing as the Australians who were volunteers. The message is particularly confusing. And then, why have the two infantrymen not been put on the same level as the white French Christian foot soldiers? And with them, why doesn't the Australian figure with his British comrades? We could talk, in that case, of a kind of memorial apartheid. Let's go to Mo now to see the museum that opened only a few months ago. First remark. There again, the existence of the empire is presented in the form of symbolic objects. You can see the map of France and its empire. This map was on the wall of every single primary school class in France till 1960. I remember this. Next. This is a picture taken from the cover of a French child's school exercise book. It celebrates the capture of Son-Tay, which was the stronghold in Tonkin, Vietnam, on 1883 by Amiral Courbet's troops. More pictures of this kind were to be found in children's chocolate snacks and so on. As far as the narrative of the war itself is concerned, colonies and colonial population make only a fleeting appearance in the exhibition, which is divided into 9 sections, each indicated by a letter. Letter A, a new war. Talks of war objects used at war, arms, and so on. There is no reference to colonials. In section B, total mobilization. And concerning supply difficulties, it's just mentioned that thanks to their colonies, France and Great Britain did not suffer as much from food restrictions. In the same section, regarding propaganda and imagery, a poster does at least feature African troops. This poster features the stereotypes of the period with no comments for the public. A whole section is devoted to women. Section C, it illustrates the many and varied missions of women in societies at war. Also on the front, see this Serbian heroine, Milunka Sabic. It's a sculpture from 2011, resulting from a special order of the museum. In Mo, the idea is to impress visitors and to play on their emotion. Russian women combatants are also mentioned, but there is nothing on colonial women. Black troops appear at last. It's section D, entitled Daily Life in the Trenches, on a single photograph, showing them on fatigue duty. Section E, Tactics and Strategy, no colonial representation. Section F, Bodies and Souls. If the visitor is not too impatient, he can see Muslim tombs in a military cemetery on a small video screen. Section J, Living Far From Home. The accent is placed on civilian refugee population in occupied Europe and on prisoners of war. Amidst a number of allusions to prison camps, one photo clearly shows North African soldiers as war prisoners. Section H is devoted to the different theaters of operation across the world. And there is mention here of fighting for the German colonies in Africa. In fact, it's only in the 9th and last section, section I, that the wartime effort of the colonies is mentioned. This section bears the elegant title of From the Bled to the Trenches. Bled is actually military slang taken from the Arabic for village. Here, at last, the material contribution of the French colonies is underlined. The colonized supplied 2.5 million tons of merchandise during the war: metals, wheat, rice, wood, coffee, and so on. A panel specifies that the empire supplied France with almost 600,000 soldiers. On the front, France aligned units made up of soldiers from Black Africa known as the Force Noire, the Black Force, promoted by General Mangin, but considered unworthy of a civilized country by the German High Command. These regiments of Senegalese infantrymen recruited in fact in the whole of French Black Africa, turned out to be formidable fighters, often used as shock troops. They did, however, suffer slightly lesser losses than those from metropolitan France. Together with the colonial troops, they made up the majority of the units in the Dardanelles and in the Oriental Army. Just as in Peron, nothing tells the visitor or the school child how the participation of this population to the defense of the French homeland was secured. Nothing indicates their resistance to enlistment. Moreover, as in Peron, there is an obsession with the issue of African losses. Both museums insist that while the African troops participated in the harshest fighting as shock troops, they did, however, suffer slightly fewer losses than the metropolitan French troops. In addition, Peron challenged the idea of the African being used as cannon fodder. In truth, such heavy insistence is a little suspicious. Indeed, it's difficult to understand how shock troops could miraculously suffer fewer losses than other troops. Moreover, if the African troops were sent to overwinter for some of the year because they couldn't bear the rigors of the European climate, then the statistics should be re-examined. More generally, it is to be noted that both museums demonstrate a certain indifference to social and political issues. In Peron, the culturalistic approach is largely based on everyday objects and the cultural events of the time supposed to bear witness to a war culture. In Peron, war culture is put forward as explaining the tenacity of the belligerent societies and the duration of the war. For the most part, the objects on show are very fine pieces and even works of art. In that respect, the museum is faithful to the historiographical movement that claims to interpret war on the basis of exclusively elite testimonies. Colonial populations have no place in this Western European frame. In the same way, the issues of imperialism, colonialism, and racism are simply not raised. In Mo, the question can be asked differently. Does it make a statement about the war or not? For the most part, the mediation is entrusted to objects, but an object doesn't speak by itself. It says nothing without contextualization. It can move and affect, but it doesn't inform about the war. It doesn't question the war. In all, what the two major French museums of the Great War have in common is that they don't question the war. Neither of the two question the relationship of social, racial, and sexual domination. 20 years apart, both museums simply conjure up the military and diplomatic power struggles. In both accounts, the war is similar to a natural catastrophe. Does that suffice to understand the outburst of violence? Finally, and in conclusion, have these two important museums missed a great opportunity, an opportunity to wave the national fabric at last by fully ingraining the sacrifices imposed upon the population of the empire into the French memory? Should it be reminded that a number of the former infantrymen, of the former laborers, remained in France afterwards? That their descendants formed the massive flux of African immigration to France after 1945, that their children and grandchildren were born in France and as such are fully French in their own right while being fully apart. The history of the Great War is common to people of French stock and to those of immigrant descent. The history of the war and of common sacrifice could be an entry point toward better integration and appeasement for young teenagers who have dropped out of school, who are searching for their identity and their roots. But this requires the necessary willpower. The mayor of Crown uses the Chemin des Dames battle precisely as an educational tool to achieve better coexistence. He receives so-called difficult children from ghetto housing estates regularly on his battlefield, the Chemin des Dames. His experience shows how sharing the history of their country through the memory of their ancestors who came to defend France against their free will most of the time overwhelms these young people. Some of them find their grandfathers' tomb in the cemeteries. They go back home transformed for life. That's where we come back to politics and the weight of political decision makers. The Museum of Mo is finally the mirror of its initiator. Jean-François Copé, strong man of the liberal, uninhibited right wing, and very much hostile to immigrants and French children resulting from African immigration today. Before ending, I would like to remind you that he was a member of the government of Mr. Sarkozy, the author of a much remarked upon speech, alas, in Dhaka at the start of his time in office, when he said that black people never entered the history. Thank you.
Frederick, thanks very much. Much food for thought in what you've said to us, and I'm sure questions will emerge from the floor later on in response to what you've said today. Our final speaker of the session is Dr. Rania Bendik, and he is going to speak on the theme of the rediscovered war, as you will see in the program, subtitled German Historiography and Warfare in the Colonies. So a very interesting talk in prospect as we think about the way in which in texts, I suppose, in historiography, we confront the past or don't confront the past in terms of warfare in the colonies. Thanks very much, René.
Thank you for this introduction. Right, I will speak about German historiography and warfare in the colonies. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear students, the First World War and even more the former colonies are issues that have largely disappeared from public attention in Germany. But this has not always been like this. In the following overview, I want to outline the different stages in which German historiography dealt with German warfare in the colonies and explain the specifically German way of dealing with this issue. And I will start with the war itself. At the beginning of the First World War, the German colonies were soon conquered by the Allies. Only in East Africa, the fights continued even after the end of the war in Europe until the 14th of November in 1918. It was here that General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck gained his legendary fame as a hero who, being, I quote, undefeated in the field, defied a far superior enemy. In the German war propaganda, the colonies played an important part, in spite of, or maybe because of these failures that the German colonies were conquered at the beginning of the war. These failures provided evidence to the alleged intention to attack and for the military objectives of the Allies to destroy Germany's international recognition, her commercial settlements, and thus her economy. This was connected with the imagination that the Africans had fighting faithfully and bravely alongside their German masters because they, and now I quote a paper, the Illustrierte Zeitung dedicated in spring 1918 an issue to the actually already lost war in the colonies. So the Illustrierte Zeitung said that the Africans, I quote, felt attacked, felt that their mother country was in danger of being taken by foreign conquerors who would violate peace, bring war and devastation into the country, and subjugate the people to an unbearable hard rule. The later myth of the faithful Askari was created here during the First World War and conveyed the impression that a hierarchically structured symbiosis between Germans and Africans, which had been chosen freely by the latter, who accepted German rule on their own free will. Under the conditions of the latter peace treaty of Versailles, this interpretation formed the basis to justify demands to return German colonies and to make all kinds of German responsibility for the war and its consequences seem completely unjustified. The Askari rather advanced to an icon of the depiction of German colonial war, which made the reproaches of the Allies seem like mendicious, seem like bad propaganda. After the First World War, a critical discussion of the development of the World War and the colonies did not take place. Debates in Germany were influenced by the perception of the Treaty of Versailles. The Article 231 provoked a particular outrage as it declared Germany responsible for the outbreak of the war, mainly to justify reparations. Directly after the war, however, this was also meant as a moral judgment fixing Germany's guilt. The Germans called these accusations Kriegsschuldlüge, the war guilt lie. With regard to the colonies, the Article 22 of the treaty ordered Germany to cede to give up all the colonies to the, I quote, advanced nations. This expression makes it clear that Germany was not regarded as an advanced nation. The Allies emphasized their judgment about Germany in their answer to German objections regarding the treaty. The famous Note d'envoi, the covering letter, dated on the 16th of June in 1919, they declared, I quote, Germany's failure concerning colonial civilization has become too obvious to allow the Allies to agree to a second attempt and to assume responsibility for leaving 13 to 15 million native peoples to the fate they have been liberated from through the war. These expressions form the basic conditions whenever Germany regarded the colonial warfare in the 1920s and 1930s. With reference to the term Kriegsschuldlüge, war guilt lie, the Allies' accusations were referred to as the colonial guilt lie. The German authors wanted to refute this guilt to criticize the Treaty of Versailles itself. Under these conditions, a critical discussion of German warfare was impossible if the author did not want to appear as a traitor of the nation. These interpretations, which were developed during the war, were thus extended unchained into the time of peace and gained high plausibility for the contemporaries, considering how they perceived the present. The Treaty of Versailles seemed to confirm the statements of the German war propaganda. Memoirs of administrators and military people who had once been responsible in the colonies, dominated the public and scientific discourse. Warfare in East Africa formed the center of interest because it had only ended on the 14th of November 1918, 3 days after the armistice in Europe, although Leto Vorbeck's troops had not been defeated militarily. For many contemporaries, these incidents confirmed the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab and the back legend, which maintained that the German army had been undefeated in the field and had been forced to give up fight because the civilians in the home country allegedly failed. The African theater of war, far away from the German home front, seemed to prove that the German troops would have been able to withstand an hostile superiority very well if they had not been inhibited by allegedly corrosive influence of their home country. The writings of General Leto Vorbeck and the last governor in East Africa, Heinrich Schnee, had special importance, and that's why they will be in the center of the following analysis. The direction of the debates shows that Germany was not interested in the events in the colonies as such. The discussion of colonial warfare was rather explored in current political conflicts, the rejection of the Weimar Republic and the fight against the Treaty of Versailles. Soon after the war, Leto Vorbeck published 2 books which influenced the image of the colonial warfare in Germany for decades. In 1919, the book My Memories of East Africa were published, which was reprinted again and again until the 1940s. In 1920, a popular and young people version entitled Haya Safari, Germany's Fight in East Africa, appeared on the market. Colonial warfare seemed like an adventure, like a quixotic fight in which the Germans would not have lost and in which they had always been supported faithfully by the Askaris. To prove this idea, this assumption, Leto Vorbeck quoted British officers and the Askaris again and again. 2 examples will suffice here. Having been captured by British officers in 1918, Leto was allegedly told by them, as he quote verbatim, and now I quote, we the British, grant you your colonies and can only hope that you will get them back. England has enough colonies, and in contrast to the widespread belief that the Germans do not know how to deal with the native populations, we have to say that the attitude of your people proved the opposite. We have to talk to your people. They are still proud today that they are German Askaris. Leto claimed that the Askaris said farewell to him and to the other Germans with the following words in 1918. I quote, we the Askaris, who belong to you and lived through all the joy and pain together with you from the beginning of the war, know that you have not been defended by the British, neither at home nor here. We know that it is true that Germany resisted her enemies victoriously for 4 years. We know what kind of power there is in Germany. The fact that our small troop resisted the enemy throughout the whole war and that the English, despite all their great efforts, were not able to defeat us is more than evidence that they cannot have won the war in Europe either. You ought to know that we acknowledged you as our masters and that we wish that you will come back and that this country will be under German government. Well, dear colleagues, it is more than obvious that these alleged quotations were to function as appeals against the so-called colonial guilt lie and for the alleged accuracy of the stab and the back legend. The Germans, however, regarded them as authentic statements of a victorious German officer. Nevertheless, those who had been responsible in Africa know exactly that these were fairy tales which had nothing at all to do with reality of the war. Heinrich Schnee, the German governor of East Africa, had objected to Leto's warfare, but the general simply defeats the objections of his superior, so that we have to say today that his warfare was basically mutiny against the civilian authority. After returning from Africa in 1919, Schnee writes a secret report for the Reichskolonialamt, the Imperial Colonial Office, in which he complains Leto's ruthless warfare toward the black population. But the Reichskolonialamt, however, advised him not to publish his report and the difference between him and Leto. Reports about the war in the colonies were only interesting with regards to their function for the present. Thus, Schnee did not write about his conflicts with Leto in his memoirs, and he praised his, I quote, brilliant leadership. Only between the lines, expressions emphasizing Leto's ruthless energy make the reality of the war shine through, but only for the critical reader. With the handing over of power to the National Socialists, discourse about colonial war changed, and warfare and the memories of it became the center of attention. In the course of Germany's rearmament, military role models were needed to give their names to the new barracks. In the meantime, Leto Vorbeck had become a living legend. Barracks were named after him. He himself saw his military commitment as a role model for the new National Socialist Wehrmacht, which were built up at that time. On the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the Battle of Tanga in 1934, Leto declared in Potsdam, I quote, "We suffered with silence and implicitness, which we do not accept anybody to honor, but which is the root of our national and racial greatness. With our demands of complete readiness and military virtues, we East Africans were the pioneers of the new Germany." These statements are close to the ideas of National Socialist ideology, which glorifies the experience of war, comradeship of the trenches at the birth of the National Socialism, which had formed a new man who lost all weakness and softness. Leto himself described war as an incident creating values for society. I quote the conclusion of Haya Zafari, this book dedicated to the young people. "We must not forget the enormous achievements of our people and our soldiers in the war against a whole world. These achievements must inspire our hope and our future." For him, war and the experience of war were thus means of regeneration for the German people. It is true that after the end of World War II, interests in colonial questions decreased considerably. Germany, which was occupied and divided into two states, had completely different problems than dealing with the development of World War I in her former colonies. Nevertheless, in the contrast to the crimes of National Socialists, warfare in East Africa seemed like a honorable and quixotic fight. The Askaris' alleged loyalty remained a topos of the representations. Such stories, fabulous as they were, worked like balm for the soul of the Germans, labeled by the National Socialist crimes. Lettow-Vorbeck spread the illusion that there were also decent German military people whose actions had been met with general consent. Consequently, several barracks were named after Lettow-Vorbeck during the rearmament of the Federal Republic of Germany. His stylization, however, also spared a romanticized and trivialized picture of the war in East Africa. The other German state, the German Democratic Republic, are a totally contrary picture of colonial warfare. I repeat. In the other German states, the German Democratic Republic, a totally contrary picture of colonial warfare was drawn. As the files of the Imperial Colonial Office were stored in archives of the GDR until 1989, East German authors had easy access to their sources and paint a much more critical and realistic picture of warfare than their colleagues from the West. Klaus Helbig, a high-profile GDR historian in this field, already offered a critical biography of Lettow-Vorbeck in his dissertation in 1986. In his further studies, he examined German warfare in East Africa in detail. This was the first time that a German historian critically discussed German warfare, taking into consideration the African populations and highlighting that European powers settled their conflicts in foreign countries and at foreign costs. This analysis, however, remained without influence in West Germany as much as it followed the ideological concept of Marxism-Leninism. The East German historians did not only want to denounce the imperialistic powers during the First World War. With regard to West Germany, it was clear to them that, and now I quote Klaus Helbig, the official policy was not learned. The official policy has not learned anything from two lost world wars and prepares new aggression diplomatically, domestically, and militarily. That is why it is still today in the 1960s, 1970s, is still today a highly topical importance to unmask German imperialism and militarism and its manifestations at the time of the First World War. Well, criticism of German imperialism became here a weapon in the Cold War. In West Germany, a critical discussion of colonial warfare only started with the student movement in 1968, although only slowly. Two aspects have to be distinguished here. First, ways of dealing with the memory of colonial past in the public space in forms of monuments, street or barrack names, and then, secondly, the scientific discussions. Since the 1918s, there have been more initiatives by citizens in order to rename streets or barracks. Here, the name Lettow-Vorbeck was in the center of attention again. Meanwhile, there is no barrack of the Bundeswehr, the German army, carrying his name anymore. Renaming then was preceded by fierce conflicts. The Lettow-Vorbeck barrack in Hamburg received special attention. In 1933, a relief, and now we can see a picture of this relief, was put up here, which shows a larger-than-man life representation of German officers, askaris, and bearers who, Nazi art style with hard and chiseled facial features, expressed determination and dedication. The relief outlived the war. After Germany's rearmament, the Bundeswehr used the barrack under its old name, Lettow-Vorbeck Barracks. When the garrison was closed in 1999, a controversial debate about the relief started. Finally, it was put up at its old site again after restoration and turned into a museum ensemble which is regarded as a post-colonial site of memory. The relief, which was once created to glorify the colonial war, is now meant to be put into its historical context and to inform about the colonial wars with the help of text and picture panels. Such a rededication is a tightrope walk. To simply dismantle the relief would also mean to deny this part of German history and to conventionally dispose of the past, which does not have to be discussed afterwards. In contrast to that, a rededication of memorials does not make their questionable messages disappear, but tries to convey their dubiety to the present-day observer. This is certainly an important educational value, which is, however, not understood by all contemporaries. In many German towns where, and, oh, no, sorry, I'm a bit short of time. Well, since the 1990s, there has been active research, yet limited to specialists, which has broken with the old legend of Germany colonial historiography. In the context of the cultural term of historiography, the reasons for this development are that the German archives had been brought together after the German reunification, and that German, French, English, and Belgian archives had been analyzed systematically. At the same time, there is finally a critical view on the relevant memoir literature, which has always shown the brutal reality of colonial warfare when it was read between the lines. In the course of this new vitality, the myth of the allegedly faithful Askari was analyzed, as well as the fate of the few Africans living in Germany after 1918. Moreover, war in the former colonies was examined, and biographies of the leading personalities were published. The publishing house Christoph Links Verlag in Berlin is a kind of pacemaker of this development, as it published the series Schlaglichter der Kolonialgeschichte, Bright Lights on Colonial History, which started in 2001 and comprise now 9 volumes. Compared to British and French historiography, colonial issues concerning World War I still have a marginal position in Germany. The German memory of World War I is a European war. The last German overall view of the First World War dedicated a little less than 2 of its 331 pages to colonial warfare. Nevertheless, the attitude towards the colonial past has changed considerably. In public space, the colonial heroes of the past are now seen with a critical distance. Moreover, the Africans themselves form a new center of attention, as they were affected by European warfare inside their countries. If we consider former positions of German historiography concerning World War I and West Germany's attitude towards the events until 30 years ago, we have to say that Germany today has chosen a good way of dealing with those issues, and that's why I called my paper The Rediscovered War. We can hope that the commemoration ceremonies, which will be organized for the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of World War I, will promote public and scientific interest in the war as a world war. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rene, for shedding light on an area that I'm sure for many of us is of deep interest and many, for my case, certainly fresh knowledge indeed. We have got about 15 minutes left, and we're conscious that lunch will have to be at 1:20, I'm sure, as far as the cooks are concerned. So in that brief period, I would suggest we maybe take a handful of questions, but could I just suggest not to make comments? Refrain just from making a comment. If you have a question, I think that would be sharper, and also if you could keep it as brief and clear as possible, and perhaps direct your question to somebody if that's appropriate. And if we don't manage to cover your question, if you have another one, I'm sure the gentleman will not at all mind talking to you over lunch if you want to confront them about that. So let's say we have 1, 2, 3 questions here. Okay.
Thank you. My question is for Richard. I was very interested to learn that the French withdrew their Muslim troops from the Dardanelles because that's exactly what the British did with the one single Indian brigade that had been deployed at Gallipoli. The initial composition of that brigade included one Gurkha battalion, one Sikh battalion, and 2 Punjabi battalions, which had a significant proportion of Muslim troops. And they were then sent on to France. Subsequently, these same troops were deployed in Mesopotamia, and they had no compunction against fighting the Turks or their co-religionists. One of them actually, one of those, Shah Ahmad Khan, went on to win the Victoria Cross. My question is that, do you think that, I mean, have you come across anything, was there a dialogue between the 2 colonial powers, because they both had Muslim troops deployed on this peninsula, and they seem to have taken the same kind of action. So do you think this was concerted, or was it an individual kind of an approach? Thank you.
We'll take the second question then.
Sorry. Yes, I have just something to say, but very rapidly. And a question for Richard Fogarty, and a question for Frederick. Thank you, Richard, to have mentioned El Hajj Abdullah Bukabouya. I know him very well. But I just want to mention precisely that he was originally, before deserting French army, a French teachers college school. And they became, you showed it, propagandist, Islamic propagandist in the German Turkish army. So black is white and white is black. Question. You showed us that both German and French utilized Islam for their own national purpose, war purpose. Would it be possible to say that both German and French during the First World War tried to realize a kind of utilitarian nationalization of Islam? And if you agree with me, I think you agree with me, we spoke together. What was the historical consequence of this fact? Question for Frederick. Would it be possible to realize museums with other historical orientations? Of course, I should, of course, wish it. Because actually there are, of course, political, ideological orientations which are evident, and you showed it. But a lot of documents, are they not originally orientated towards this direction you noticed? So could it be possible to use some other documents? Where are they? And if it's true, and show them in museum with other orientations. Thank you.
Thank you. Question over here.
Yes, I also have a very short question for Professor Fogarty. And it's dealing about the material that he has for the experiences, to describe the experiences of soldiers. If I understood you correctly, those were journals and letters. And so I don't know if that's the case, but I have 3 short questions related to that. These letters, I assume, were officials only who wrote these letters. So what does that mean if for your material and for your data? What was the language used? Was it French or also other languages? And my last question is related to censorship. Were these letters censored, and what does that mean for your material? Thank you.
Okay. In responding, can we just pass along in the order in which the speakers actually took part? Is that okay? So we have a response first from Rick, and then we'll move along to Frederick. And if you wish to respond, no question directly to you there, but if you want to respond to any of the issues, you can, Irene, as well.
Okay, I will try to be brief. Yeah, the British withdrew. The British also were concerned about their troops in the Dardanelles, and as you pointed out, I am unaware of a dialogue between the British and the French about this issue. You're right; their policies converge here. The concerns are the same. And I think that's one, if I can plead, simple ignorance, because my focus was on military policy, why the Army was making this decision. And so I did not pursue this question in the Foreign Ministry archives, where I would have found the correspondence between the British ambassador and so forth. So I simply don't know. I would be surprised, though, if there wasn't some kind of, coordination of policy in that area. It's, I think your question implies that it's likely that that's the case. Excuse me. Gilbert Meunier has asked about. He talked about Bukabuya. He had taken, and he pointed out, and I should have, that he took the name El Hajj Abdallah after his desertion, and this was kind of his nom de plume, or his pseudonym as a writer of propaganda tracts. And yes, he was a teacher before the war and highly assimilated, and in fact deserted the most likely explanation, he offered a number of explanations, but the most likely explanation is that he was passed over for promotion, and the person promoted above him was a pied noir, or an Algerian colonist. And so there's a real rage in his writing toward the pied noir. That is, European Algerians. Yeah. So okay, so yes, were the French and the Germans trying to nationalize Islam? I think that was one strand of what was happening there, and one of the things we do have to remember, and we do this as historians, is we tend to, because we want to explain, we tend to maybe simplify things, and I'm not sure that I did a very good job of capturing the sort of chaos, certainly of wartime, and the chaos of policy making in the French and German cases. In telling these stories, in other words, we have a tendency to make a narrative that makes a lot more sense than the very messy history as it happened. But I do think that was something that was going on. And what are the historical consequences of this? I'm not sure what the imprints left I'm not sure what the imprints left on the post-war world really were of this. I think that would require a specialist in the interwar period of these specific colonies as they're concerned, and I just haven't made a close study of that. Finally, Evelyn, the sources, and I'll try to be really brief here because I have a lot to say about the sources. My sources are both French and German, and so you have a great deal of discourse about this and the records in the Foreign Ministry of the camp itself. And so we learn about the soldiers' behaviors and their words from the perspective of the Germans, and then also and from the perspective of the French. And these men told their stories. They find the ones who survived finally came back to French control, And they told their stories in what we might call interrogations, but in fact, I'd probably use a different word I'd call interviews. Because we have to remember that the French officials were aware that these soldiers were forced into service. So they weren't interrogating with a goal of prosecuting these soldiers for having been traitors, but they were actually interviewing the soldiers with a view to bringing war crimes charges against the Ottomans. But then the Ottoman Empire disappears in a wave of fire and blood, frankly, and there's no point in prosecuting war crimes trials. So there are these interviews with French officials. There's censored letters and all sort of intelligence reports. So in fact, there's a copious documentation. I do want to, I think your questions do indicate that I have to be cautious in saying that I really know exactly what was in the minds of these men, because these are still filtered sources where, and this is why I try to be careful in the way I talk about them. They wrote the letters. Some of them may have been in French, but the ones in Arabic, the records that we have are French translations, and they're from the censors, and they only translate the parts they're interested in. So again, these are imperfect sources to be sure. Even the interviews would have taken place with interpreters present and that sort of thing. And so yes, these are censored letters. And so, right, the sources are imperfect. I'm always asked about this, and they're very good questions and very legitimate. But and some people, you didn't imply this, but sometimes people say, well, how can you really know what the story really is of these soldiers? And I say, well, that's true of all of the history that we do. Sources are always imperfect and fragmentary and filtered, and we do our best to be critical with them and that sort of thing. But to my mind, the alternative is to leave this story lying there in the archives untold. Yeah. And I think that we have enough, if we're careful with the sources, to hear some of the colonized in their own words, telling us their stories. And that's very rare. And so I want to take the opportunity, but be cautious at the same time. So thank you for that question.
Frederick, you wish to say something here?
Well, thank you, Gilbert. Just to say that, sure, it's difficult to imagine a new approach or another approach now, today, in France or in Europe. Because we have the domination of interpretation is very strong. It's cultural history which dominates the scholarship, les études, the studies, yes. And of course, we can use the same objects I show in a different way. Of course, a new approach is going to be shown in Montpellier with a new museum of Algeria. But it's difficult, nevertheless, because for cultural history, society is homogeneous. There is no class, there is no gender, there is no politics, there is no social. Everybody is equal. Everybody shares the same beliefs. That's just a tale for children, but it's a strong tale nowadays. It's difficult to write, to publish a different approach of it.
Okay, everybody, I think that's all for our session. I'd like to thank, and I'm sure you would as well, our participants. Today we've had by Skype a talk by Chris Manjapra from America. We've had the three gentlemen who are with me on the platform, all contributing to what I think has been a rich and thought-provoking morning's study. So if you could show your appreciation, I will suggest that lunch is at 1 is at 2:20, so we have an hour to refresh ourselves, and then we're back for what should be an equally interesting session, looking at Bengal and the Great War. Looking forward to that very much. Thank you.